Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I've read all of your comments. To the person that said you are my hero, big heart to you. Hello in rainy France. It is definitely raining in England today. My name is Aja Barber, and I am a writer who happens to have an Instagram account. And I talk about cycles of consumption and fast fashion, and the fashion industry being more intersectional and the roots of all of these systems in which we find ourselves sometimes yielding to, when perhaps maybe it would do us better to not. So I am presenting the history of fast fashion today. It's weird, I can't see myself on the presentation, so I feel like I'm probably looking all over the place, but that's okay.
You look amazing.
Well, thank you very much. um, so we're going to talk about the history of fast fashion today. And this is not going to be an overwhelming history because honestly, there are many books written about this topic, including one that I have written. And this is just to give you the framework to understand how this system came to be. Because one of the things that I've realized within my work is that for people that are younger, particularly Gen Z, many people don't remember a world where fast fashion wasn't king. And people also barely remember a world where social media didn't exist. And the two are very much intrinsically linked. So we're going to do a little history, and we'll talk about I'll leave lots of time for your questions. The one thing I won't do is rate brands. Last time I did a class like this, everyone wanted to know if their favorite brand was greenwashing. What I hope to do is give you the tools to make those decisions for yourself, because at the end of the day, it is not about consuming more. It is about being more thoughtful in our consumption. So I think we are 6 after. Without further ado, let's dive in. History of fast fashion. Here we go. So we are going to define how fast fashion got to be what it is today. We'll touch on the history of how it was built and define it, but we'll spend a lot of time talking about the last 30 years because that is when things really, really amped up. We're going to go chapter by chapter. So first, the history, the last 30 years, who fast fashion hurts, what needs to change, and in conclusion, what can you do? So what is fast fashion anyway? In a nutshell, it is cheaply made clothing produced in large volumes based off of a business model which produces large profits, but requires a quick turnover of goods. Fast fashion waters down trends taken directly from the catwalk and turns them over quickly for large profit, often at the expense of people and planet. One thing people need to really understand is that we need a slower pace of life in general, because the speed in which we're going is definitely aiding in the climate crisis. We are using up resources faster. Um, and in general, I'm not really sure if this instantaneousness is really, working for us. When we think about the popularity of 2-day shipping, people seem to believe that 2-day shipping should be the norm. But in actuality, all of that speed is definitely aiding in the climate crisis. Things don't just magically appear. They take, planes and cars and fossil fuels. And so if everybody is wanting everything immediately right now, we're already looking at a percentage of carbon that is being amplified by the popularity of this system. So in general, we need to slow things down. What does fast fashion require? So there's 4 points which are required for a garment to be grouped under the term fast fashion. 1, low prices for the customer at the cost of the environment and the garment workers. One thing that people always talk about, which I think is a little bit deceiving, is we talk about clothing as affordable when we're talking about this system, but someone else always eats the cost. And it is usually not the business that is selling you that garment. It is the person who has been underpaid on the cotton, which is grown in their part of the world. It's the garment worker who's making the garment. There is a cost for everything. And when we start cutting corners, somebody isn't getting paid, but it's never the billionaire at the top. 2, a short timeline for manufacturing. So in the past, we had 4 seasons a year that the fashion calendar sort of operated on. And within recent years, you see some stores where fast fashion seasons are 50 in a year. Now, when we say a season, we're talking about the amount of times that clothing is put out on the floor, new things for you to buy. So every time you go into a store, go, they've got new things every time I'm here. That's a new season. And that's actually not really a good thing because you probably don't need to buy something every time you go into a store. 3, it's extremely trendy. Micro trends, which remain trendy for a short amount of time, causing the customer to consume more. So we've gone from trends to micro trends where, here's a dress that's really popular and you see it on tons of Instagrammers. And then in the next week, there's another dress that is also popular. And you're suddenly going, but I just got this dress. Does that mean I have to get that dress as well? Micro trends. And then, of course, disposable products, which products with built-in planned obsolescence. So the next question you're probably asking is, what is planned obsolescence? It's designing a product with an artificially limited useful life or designing a purposely frail design. And that definition comes from Wikipedia. What is the history of planned obsolescence? It's the automobile industry. So this comes from Ursula de Castro's book, Loved Clothes Last. And Ursula is the director and founder of Fashion Revolution. And Ursula says in her book, it started in the USA in the 1920s with General Motors to encourage the buying of more cars more often. It was originally intended as a way to increase production and jobs by deliberate manipulation of the design of the product in order for it to break soon. That attitude started with cars and it pretty much spread to everything within our society. So there is a man named Victor Lebau, and Mr. Lebau really deserves some credit here. He was an American retail economist, and arguably the brain behind this system that we see ourselves in. So this is a direct quote from Mr. Lebau. Our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption a way of life, that we convert the buying and use of goods into rituals, that we seek our spiritual satisfaction, our ego satisfaction in consumption. We need things consumed, burned up, replaced, and discarded at an ever accelerating rate. After World War II, economies around the world needed a real boost, and that was when planned obsolescence really became the norm and things sort of started to speed up. So patented in 1846, the sewing machine ushered in a new genre of fast fashion and dramatically brought down the price of garments as well as increased the means of production. One of the things that I think you have to know when looking at all of these systems is that at the start and finish of these systems is marginalized people. The phrase cotton is king sort of started around the slave trade, and the slave trade did help to sort of bring cotton to all different parts of the world that were struggling with it, thus speeding up the cycle of how people were able to consume clothing. So when we look at the resources that that go into the fashion industry, a lot of them come from countries in the global south. When we look at who is dealing with cotton today, that's definitely people in the global south. And we look at who has traditionally picked cotton, my ancestors. So you really need to understand that there are marginalized people being harmed at every step of the system. If you think about who made the clothing you were wearing right now, if you don't know where that item was made, there's a very good chance that it was a non-white person who made it, probably in the global south. And there's a very good chance that if it were bought from certain stores, maybe they weren't paid a very fair wage for their labor. So that's something to really keep in mind. And the thing is, as we had the American Industrial Revolution, that also obviously sped up how things were made. You had inventions like the cotton gin, which was credited to Eli Whitney, but if you look and do a little digging, there's a lot of sources that say that a slave actually came up with the gin. Eli Whitney was the only person that could get the patent for it because he was white. So that's worth digging into. At every step of this system, there's messiness. But the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory happened March 25th, 1911. The system of fast fashion began claiming lives early in. In addition to oppression of chattel slavery, industrialized factories proved to be dangerous and deadly when a factory located in New York City's Lower East Side caught on fire, killing 146. The garment workers killed were mostly young Italian and Jewish immigrant women. They had been locked in the factory and couldn't escape. Accidents such as this are doomed to repeat themselves over and over again in the fashion industry. It never improves itself. It just moves to countries with less regulation and safety. While this accident was a catalyst for regulation in America, these laws do not extend overseas. So after this disaster happened, America had a bit of a, people organized and said, this cannot be. And we learn about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and well, I learned about it in civics. So I was about 14. And I think, the what was taught was, oh yeah, and now we have regulation, and so that's great and done. But at the time, what was actually happening were more production from the United States was being shifted overseas really rapidly. And that was a way of escaping the regulation that we have for safety of ourselves in America, basically. So, what is NAFTA? In the 1990s, we're talking about the 1990s, NAFTA stands for the North American Free Trade Agreement, and it established a free trade zone in North America. It was signed in 1992 by Canada, Mexico, the United States, and took effect January 1st, 1994. NAFTA immediately lifted tariffs on the majority of goods produced by signatory nations. Basically, in conclusion, NAFTA made it easier for corporations in the US to exploit overseas labor because if you have a factory and you have to actually be very responsible for the people that work within that factory, and you don't want to do that because you don't want to pay fairly, you don't want to offer benefits, you don't want to treat workers the way they should be treated, you can just go around that and go and get it produced overseas. So what is the race to the bottom? That's something you're going to hear a lot in the fashion production conversation. It's a way in which fashion brands compete against each other to see who can pay their workers the least in order to produce clothes the quickest and the cheapest. This usually includes talking factories down in traditionally pillaged countries in order to get the lowest possible price while knowing that there will always be a human cost. Someone else pays for the low price always. So I have watched a lot of reality TV about the fashion industry. It seems like in the UK, there was a big boom of like reality TV about, in the style and boohoo. And one of the things that I always notice is that they always do a little cheeky video where they try and make it seem like it's clever and cool to talk a factory down. And it's always usually a smiling white girl who's talking to the factory. And she's like, I'm really, really good at my job. And she's basically forcing them to make products for an extremely low price because the factory doesn't really have the strong arm here. They don't want to lose the business. And so they end up going lower than they possibly can. And that brings me to my next thing. I've heard big brands say, the exploitation happens when we go to a factory and they outsource the labor that we give them. And that's not our fault. One can say that, except you know what you're doing when you talk a factory down to a price that they can't really pay people on. You know what you're doing, and you don't actually care because if you did, you wouldn't engage in that. And so when brands say that when outsourcing happens, they did know that human hands can only work so fast. They did know that elves don't make their clothing. And so there's something very disingenuous about stores sort of engaging in an act where they talk factories down and then going, oh, well, this is not our fault. We didn't know. I think you kind of did know. The race to the bottom is the reason brands and websites can offer you new products daily and weekly. So for this section, I listened to an episode of Adam Ruins Everything, Why Fast Fashion is Failing Us. And these are quotes that come from Laura McAndrews, who is now a professor. And this is based on her experience working at the Gap. She's worked for a few other places as well. And I wasn't surprised by any of these quotes, but they really did confirm everything I believed about what was happening to the fashion industry within my lifetime, because I kind of began to realize that things were getting cheaper. And there was always a part of me in the back of my head that kind of knew that it wasn't actually okay. So they rushed to Bangladesh. When McAndrews says this, she is talking about how fashion moves from country to country. In my lifetime, I've seen it go to China, I've seen it go to Bangladesh, I've seen it go to Vietnam and Cambodia, Mexico, El Salvador. And basically, whenever the industry begins to understand that they can get labor for a much cheaper price, it moves. And so when she says they rushed to Bangladesh, she's talking about the fashion industry and Bangladesh basically trying to become this hub with, little safety, little regulation, but brands being like, well, if you have the machinery, we'll bring it to you. And why are we doing that? Because the wages are lower here than they are over in that part of the world. I saw deplorable factories. I had very little ability, probably integrity, to stand up and say, this doesn't seem right, because I was trained by high level to be, do they have the machinery? Can they do it cheap? I was complicit because they were giving me the prices I needed, and the bottom line was all that mattered to these companies. We knew a lot of things weren't going to stand up over time. And that quote, she's talking about the quality of clothing and planned obsolescence. And she does go on to talk a bit more about how, the conversation at Gap was, we always need to give her something new, her being the customer, because a lot of the marketing is unfortunately aimed at women. It's all about the price. This is when she's talking about pricing. A lot of times my target was an 82% markup. The company got the markup from what landed the garment in the US to what the consumer bought at the full price. We would never mark down anywhere to where we weren't still making around 40%. So what does that mean? It means that when you see a full price, 82% of that is going to the brand, which means that the other 18% is materials, labor, shipping, taxes, labor. How much is this person? How much could someone possibly make when 12% of the price of a garment is going to cover all of those things? So let's get into the last 30 years, because this is what I've seen within my lifetime. Do you remember the first time you began to see a shift in the ways you bought fashion? I do. I tell this story in my book about how I grew up not actually getting a lot of new clothing. I grew up wearing hand-me-downs. And I grew up in a lower middle class family. We weren't poor, but we weren't like rolling around in piles of money either. And I remember actually paying more money for my clothing than what we pay today. So an example of this is I was 13 and I wanted a pair of Oshkosh dungarees or overalls if you're in the United States. And Oshkosh used to have a factory in the US that was a union factory, and they made overalls for all ages. And I knew that it was a mark of quality. I knew that Oshkosh was like a solid brand. I've always loved a dungaree. And so my local store that sold like all the teenagey goods had the Oshkosh dungarees, but they were $55, which in today's inflation is around 83 US dollars. Um, Nothing that we see really on the high street or in the mall really is hitting that price range because the price of clothing is artificially depressed, essentially. We have seen everything go up within our lifetime: cars, houses, education. But when it comes to clothing, we've actually seen it go down. And that's because the system is run by exploitation of people. So I wanted these overalls. And in my mind, that price was fair because I knew that this was a company that was giving jobs to people and they had to pay them. But to my parents, they were like, no, we can't afford it. So I waited for my birthday and the overalls arrived, but they weren't the ones that I wanted. It was a lower cost. It was a lower cost pair of overalls. They were still nice, but they were only $40, but I really wanted the Oshkosh ones. So I returned them to the store and I used $15 of my babysitting money, which was, hard labor. And I got those Oshkosh overalls and I wore them every week, twice a week for 2 years. So there was a time period where we were definitely wearing our clothing more. And I have seen that change within my life cycle. So who was the first fast fashion retailer? The origins of fast fashion of the first fast fashion retailer aren't very clear. However, H&M, Zara, Topshop, Primark, and Uniqlo were all brands which I became familiar with from Europe, though Uniqlo is Japanese. The first time I encountered fast fashion, I was immediately hooked. Once these brands began to open in America in the early 2000s, I quickly noticed that American brands like Gap beginning to mimic their business model in a bid to keep up. Within 30 years of my life, I have seen the quality and price of clothing go down, and as the speed and volume increases with every year. Another big part of the puzzle is social media. um, for those of you that don't remember, like Gap used to be a brand that was like super good quality and it also was not very cheap. When the first Gap opened in my town, I remember all of the little like rich kids had like all their Gap clothing and I felt woefully left out because my mom was like, I'm not paying $20 for a t-shirt. So it wasn't always as inexpensive as it is today. I have seen that happen and it makes me a bit sad. But let's get on to social media. As fashion was speeding up in the last 30 years, volume and speed in which clothing is put out and pushed, while the quality decreased, something else changed: the way we purchase. There is a direct correlation in the linear path between the popularity of social media and the speed in which we consume clothing. A New York Times profile on Gen Z shoppers revealed many interviewees were afraid of being seen wearing the same clothing on social media. So I haven't seen any like studies about this, but it makes a lot of sense to me that, in the timeline that I've seen MySpace and Facebook and Instagram and blogging, which is stuff that I talk about in my book, that that cycle of clothing has also sped up. And I think that the correlation there it's pretty clear and present. And I hope that someone does do a really, really good study on that because I dive into that. So my next question is, how much clothing do influencers sell? For those of you that are already familiar with my work, you know that I have never taken a penny from fast fashion on my grid. As a matter of fact, the only sponsor I have is SPR Collective. I don't really want to sell people new things because I actually believe that that is tenfold a huge part of the problem. So how much clothing do influencers sell? A lot. Now, obviously, the billionaires at the top of all of these big brands that are exploiting people are to blame for all of this, but people with large platforms do play their part too. I have 236,000 followers. If I sell an item one day on Instagram and 1% of my readership buys that item, that is 2,360 items sold. If I do this 5 days a week, that's 11,800 pieces sold. Annually, that's 3,009,000 items of clothing being sold. If I chose to sell something every day and 1% of my audience bought the item, I would also be really rich if I did that, but I wouldn't be able to sleep at night. And so there's no point in that. And also, I don't think I ever want to be outrageously wealthy within my life because the world is burning and I don't actually think it's that great of a look. So I aspire to do different things. Who fast fashion hurts? So the Rana Plaza disaster happened April 24th, 2013. A garment factory in Bangladesh collapsed while workers were inside, killing 1,134 innocent people. Workers noticed the visible cracks in the building and were forced to work there even though they feared for their lives. Through the system of outsourcing, brands can claim ignorance to impending disasters, but every low price has a human cost. And I think that Rana Plaza definitely made a lot of people really wake up, including myself. But I was very saddened to to see that it was buried in American news. It was not front page news at all. But that's also similar to how the media is treating the climate emergency. So not shocking, very disappointing though. So here's some bummer news about consumption. 100 billion garments are produced every year. 2, the average garment is worn just 7 times. 3, 20% of all items go unsold. So I want to stop at 3, and I want to remind you that in the climate crisis, we're looking at potential water shortages, which means that you literally have brands that are, let's see, throwing out virtually 20 billion items. That is a lot of cotton t-shirts. That's a lot of denim. That's a lot of materials that don't need to be harvested, where those materials can go in different and better directions. And so you need to understand that we can read all the stats about how the fashion industry is contributing to the climate crisis, and it most certainly is. But remember that things like throwing away items that you're never going to sell and just pushing so much product on the consumer is a huge part of the climate crisis as well. So 4, 18 million adults in the US suffer from a shopping addiction. I learned that while researching my book. 5, shoppers buy 5 times more clothing today than in 1980. 6, 60% of garments contain fabrics derived from fossil fuels. This is something that people do not understand. Polyester, it is oil, it is plastic. It will probably be on this planet for longer than you and I will. I have bought items within my lifetime where I think that item is just probably sitting in a landfill, never decomposing. And that actually makes me quite sad. 7, the average shopper buys 68 items a year. When we're talking about shoppers, we're talking about fast fashion consumers. 8, one t-shirt and a pair of jeans uses 5,000 gallons of water to produce. So if one t-shirt and a pair of jeans use 5,000 gallons of water, but we know that 20 billion items of clothing are just going to landfill unsold every year, how much water usage is that in a world that's facing water shortages? Exactly. These sources come from Fashionopolis by Dana Thomas and my book, Consumed. Here's more bummer news about the environment. 1.5 trillion liters of water are used by the fashion industry every year, while 750 million humans in the world do not have access to clean drinking water. 2, 190,000 tons of textile microfibers are released into the ocean every year. And 3, 5.2% of the waste in our landfills is textile waste. Fewer than 2% of garment workers in the clothing industry earn a living wage. That is something you need to know, especially because the clothing industry is responsible for millions of jobs throughout our world. But we're not exactly improving anything with this system. So, how much clothing is being produced? It's hard to say because clothing brands are notoriously secretive about the volume of clothing they're churning out. That's something that's always sort of noted by Fashion Revolution every year when they do the transparency index. According to Fast Company, H&M alone churns out 3 billion items a year. Inditex, which is Zara and its friends, puts out 1.5 billion items in 2017. But we don't really know about Boohoo or Uniqlo or ASOS or Shein, who Shein is actually currently killing. Like all of these, all of these brands are trying to keep up with Shein, and they're sort of taking market share currently. What about Primark? What about Pretty Little Thing? My point is the planet only has 7.674 billion humans on it, meaning these brands are producing enough clothing to dress us all many times over every single year, except half the planet lives on $5.50 a day, which means they're not buying into the system because they cannot afford to. So let's half that number. All of that means there is too much clothing being produced too quickly for this planet to sustain this system. And also, fast fashion hurts independent brands and small business. Fast fashion harms independent brands because brands which pay ethically and fairly cannot compete with the ultra low prices and pay ethically and fairly. Additionally, fast fashion notoriously rips off small designers and faces little to no repercussions for it, which again kills small business. If no one can compete with Goliath, there is only Goliath. So we see this I see this every day on Twitter where someone's like, Boohoo stole my design. And then there's always people underneath it that are like, well, your prices are really high, as if someone deserves to have their design taken by a multinational company for daring to pay people fairly, where that multinational company probably isn't. It actually really bums me out and makes me sad because having economy where you only have monopolies isn't actually a healthy economy at all. It's bad for us. You have less people paying fairly. You have less choice of what to buy. You have less choice with where to work. Big fashion brands are not job creators. It is consistently proven that the fast fashion model keeps garment workers in poverty. So, how is fast fashion linked to racism? It is people of color who grow the raw materials for the clothes using their natural resources in the global north's habits. It is people of color who sew the garments and often for very low wages. It is people of color who then have the discarded garments dumped in their country under the veil of charity. It is people of color mitigating the waste system. An estimated 140 million worth around 350,000 tons of used clothing goes to landfill in the UK every year. What doesn't go to landfill ends up being donated to charity, where only 10% of it is sold. The rest is packed up and sent to traditionally pillaged countries in the global south, where it ruins the local economy and sits in a rotting trash mountain like Accra, Ghana. The system sucks. Where does my fast fashion go when I'm done? So you donated your clothing, but the problem is there's too many clothing on this planet currently. So donation is quickly becoming an ecological problem. And this is the moment where I invite you to take Liz Ricketts' class, The History of the Resale Market, Throwing Away Clothing for a Living. If your clothing ends up in Ghana, there is a very good chance it's polluting someone else's backyard or ending up in the ocean, polluting the beaches. Yuck. This is a picture of Liz, and she is on top of a rotting trash mountain, which is also something that the local municipal government pays hundreds of thousands of dollars to mitigate because this clothing is just flowing into their country. Like, how mad would you be if your taxes went to clean up a mess that you didn't create? But that is what people in the global south are facing because of this problem. What needs to change? So first of all, we need to change the way we talk about this system, because one of the biggest, most tired myths that I am tired of hearing is it's classist to critique fast fashion because of poor people. This is categorically false. Fast fashion creates billionaires, and it takes a lot of money from all classes to create a billionaire. Additionally, if 50% of the planet live on $5.50 a day, they are not the ones buying fast fashion. It takes repeat consumers buying sometimes weekly to create profits gained from the system. Don't blame poor people for this mess. A lot of times I hear people trot out that conversation, but it usually just looks like it's a middle class person wanting to defend a system they want to contribute in. I have more respect for people that are like, I don't really care, than people that say, oh, well, I really care about poor people. But then I say, great, let's talk about raising wages for everyone. And then they're like, I'm going to the mall. You know what I mean? So did you know that America consumes the most amount of fast fashion in the world? However, people who fall under the category of poor and working poor account for roughly 3% of America's wealth. That means those are not the people who drive this system. For those of you that want to learn more about class and wealth in America, I invite you to check out the Resource Generation. There are some mind-blowing stats on there. But yeah, next time the person you know who is very, very middle or upper class talks about how, oh, well, you can't really criticize that system, be like, yeah, but you're in a pretty good place where you could do better. If you could spend $500 at Shein, you can actually slow down and maybe support some companies that are doing things the right way. So what needs to change? First and foremost, we desperately need regulation so companies can no longer go overseas and exploit people. Two, currently most contracts with outsourced labor are non-binding, as we saw in the pandemic, which launched the Pay Up campaign, meaning all power lies with the brands, not factories and garment workers. Three, we need to change the way we consume and how we buy. Not every solution will be accessible to everyone, but I think all of us can be aware and make small changes in how we buy. So, we need all moving parts here. We need regulation. If you are the type of person where you want to get involved in that conversation, do that. We need people who are middle and upper class to take their head out of the sand and realize the world is on fire and maybe you don't need another top. We need everyone doing a lot of everything. And obviously, we need to regulate these companies, but we can't just expect our lawmakers to do that without us actually raising a fuss and changing the ways we want to consume. A lot of the reason why this system is allowed to go on is because the companies that are by far the worst culprits have a lot of economic power. And when you have economic power, you have more power over a lot of the countries in which you produce your clothing in. That's something that I've seen again and again, where you literally have governments that can't stand up to these billion-dollar industries because they're not as powerful. So taking away some of that economic power by putting your money somewhere else is a great way to start if you could do it. But if you can't, there are plenty of other ways to get involved. But mostly we need everyone to slow down. When I started to really dive into these topics, what I found was I massively had slowed down. I just didn't shop the way I used to, and I didn't really have an interest in it. And now I really scrutinize over things that come in my wardrobe. I do some secondhand shopping. I still wear some of my fast fashion because you should give it a good life. And I buy some ethical designers. And I've always sort of shopped the secondhand market because that's something I realized early in for myself was going to work out. But even in shopping that, it sort of forces you to slow down because it takes time to find the thing that's going to be really good and really work with you. But the speed in which things have been going for the last 20 years, we just can't sustain that. It's hurting everyone. So what is the Pay Up campaign? Pay Up is a campaign started by Remake World in order to hold brands to account who canceled and refused to pay for orders from garment workers and factories during the height of the global COVID-19 pandemic. The actions of these billion-dollar companies put economically vulnerable people in a state of despair. It was a completely evil and greedy, and I would say amoral move because the factories have no power and the brands were able to walk away and say, no, that's not our problem. Sorry. Conclusion, what can you do? What can I do? The truth is, we all got to stop buying so much. We've got to slow down massively. We should be paying more for our clothes if you can. There's always going to be people that can't. That's, you know, that is the reality of our world. Although I would like to live in a world where everyone can have nice things. That's what I'm aiming for. But the prices we see on the high street are exploitative prices built off of years of oppression. And we've been programmed to think this way, that that's a fair price. It absolutely isn't. We've been treating our planet like it's an infinite resource, and it's not our fault. That's the message which has been carefully sold to us. But regardless, I firmly believe that brands will only stop behaving this way when it hits their bottom line and not a second before. So here's just a few questions. Next time you feel the urge to part with your money and buy a garment, ask yourself, do I really need it? Can I buy it secondhand? Is this a brand I'm proud to support? Why? Or is it the marketing? And in the words of our sponsor, Vestiaire Collective, by the way, I had to say this line for their the sponsorship that I did with them, the brand film. Buy less, buy better, wear more, sell more. Thank you so much, Vestiaire Collective, for sponsoring this. I'm going to give them some props here because one of the things that I see constantly in Instagram is I see people with platforms not asking more of the groups that they want to partner with. And I will give Vestiaire Collective their flowers because early in when we were having conversations, I said, that's great that you want to work with me, but what about the Slow Factory? What about the Or Foundation? And do you know they came through? That's the power that people on social media have. And if more people used it to just stop selling people stuff and start lifting up the organizations that they want to work with and inspiring people to do more, we could actually have a really beautiful and amazing world. Lastly, this is when I do my little soft shoe shuffle and get out my soapbox. I wrote a book about this topic. I wrote a book about these subject matters and how they intersect with the climate crisis, examining our consumerism and why we engage with consumption in the ways we do. If you enjoyed this class, I hope you might buy my book from your favorite independent bookstore or Waterstones. It's out September 23rd in the UK, October 5th in the US, and it will be available worldwide. If you go into your local bookshop and they don't have it, you should just ask them to order it. They will, and they might even order more copies, which would be kind of cool. So if you want to contact me, I say that I don't answer my DMs, but if you're nice, I will definitely answer your DM. I am at Aja Barber on Instagram. It's right there in the lower part of the screen. And I also have a Patreon because I only work with one sponsor, which means that my Instagram isn't the most lucrative space. And I do live in a very expensive city. So if you find these topics interesting and you like getting a little news tidbit every day, I do have a Patreon. I would love to see you around there. But if not, I always post, well, I try and post Monday through Friday on Instagram, and I always post my writing for free there. So there's something for everyone. Thank you so much for taking this class. Thank you for hanging out with me. Like I said, it's weird because I can't see myself at all. So I might have been making like funny faces, but either way, you all are great. Thank you for being here. And I
Thank
think
you
it's
so much.
now time to get on to the questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Aja. This has been such an incredible class. I'm sure we have tons of questions. Alexandra Tyndall says, speaking of this, and here's Cintisha and Paloma who have just joined us. Meet
Hi,
them.
everyone. Hi, everyone.
Slow Factory team. Speaking of Vestiaire Collective and the booming secondhand clothing market in general, do you think this is a sustainable alternative to buying fast fashion, or does the idea of buying new clothes semi-regularly, regardless of the source, still feeds into consumerism? And if we buy fast fashion brands secondhand, are we still supporting their brand in a roundabout way? Such a good question. Thank you, Alexandra.
It's a wonderful question. So we got to slow down. You can't buy secondhand clothing at the same rate that some of us have been buying fast fashion. You can't buy anything at that rate. That's really it. Like this has got to slow. And I feel like I really enjoy Vestiaire Collective, but I go on and I'll watch that item for like a long time and sort of decide, is this something that I can really use? I think about, is it going to fit? I really use a lot of time. And I think that it's very good for you to take that time when adding to your wardrobe, but it's not going to be fast. I think whether you're doing a Shein haul or whether you're doing a thrift store haul, we got to stop with the holes. They're not great. However, I always tell people, if you buy fast fashion secondhand, there's so much of this on this planet that I'm not side-eyeing you for it. Like, if it means that it's not going to end up in the backyard of someone in the global south, then buy it secondhand, but maybe don't, walk in and decide to, oh, well, I bought this thing, so maybe I'll go get 5 more.
All the questions are incredible. And I'm seeing a theme about government, right? In there's that red common thread in a lot of the questions, is the role of government and what responsibilities do they have, and what legislation, right?
Yeah.
So just that, could you just kind of just speak to that in a general sense?
There's a few laws that are happening right now, particularly in California with garment workers, which I've tweeted about on my Twitter feed. You can find me on Twitter at Aja Says Hello, and I'm going to keep tweeting about those. In the UK, where I'm based, I tend to focus on that. And we had something called the Fixing Fashion Report, which was proposed to members of parliament a few years ago. It had about 14 addendums that were very easy to implement. And some of it was a tax for fast fashion to deal with the waste that comes from it. And members of parliament soundly rejected every single one of them. And so we're going to continue to push those. And I have joined a few groups to talk about how we get these back in, how we get these addendums back in front of our members of parliament. I just recently started communicating with my local MP about some of these topics. So I think if you are interested in learning more about this, there's a few people who I think are really sort of talking about the regulation. But in America, I would say there is absolutely not enough being done, especially since America is the biggest fast fashion consumer in the world. So we've got like a few things. The UK is the biggest fast fashion consumer in Europe. America is the biggest fast fashion consumer in the world. And then I think China beats America in numbers, but that's only because of population. So they have more people. They're not necessarily buying more clothes per person, but they have more people. And so the US is really the pivotal one here who needs to make the change, basically.
I also have a question around luxury and fast fashion. I think sometimes I get confused when I see luxury brands price, but have fast fashion prices. Could you clarify if you know anything about luxury brand production practices and if they are fast fashion or not? And
Wait, hold on. I'm confused by that question. Luxury price and fast fashion pricing. Are we talking about quality or are we talking about pricing?
Yeah, I think the question is more around, do you know if, for example, luxury fashion is the same as fast fashion in terms of their practices, and why are they pricing it more?
It depends on the brand,
Yes,
always.
I was going to say that. I was like,
yeah, it always depends on the brand. And it also depends on a lot of things. Like a lot of luxury brands sell what Business of Fashion calls premium mediocre, which is stuff that is not made very well, usually with their logo splashed across it, and it is made for a certain price point. And to sell a lot of it, premium mediocre is essentially crap, like it's not great quality. But a lot of people don't know that there's a difference there between some of the stuff. So it's really going to depend on the brand. What I will say about luxury, and this is something that I constantly struggle with because I don't really know what the answer is, we have to change the value system in our society. We have to, because people treat fast fashion like crap and they treat luxury like it has value. We need to treat everything like it has value because it all does. So like if I buy, one of the things I quickly realized when I was shopping fast fashion was that the resale value of it was nothing. And so I began to really view it as essentially a waste of my money. But one thing I always knew was that if I bought something from a luxury brand or a designer brand, if I changed my mind about it, I could go and sell it. And that's because we as a society put value on that. How do we change the value so that we're valuing everything? That's the question I have. But in that way, luxury fashion has a longer lifespan. You're not going to go to Cantamonto Market and see, a pile of like just Prada shoes. You know what I mean? They're not going to reach there. But we need to really start valuing everything that we make, and brands need to also stop creating crap. And that goes for all brands, both luxury and fast fashion.
Yes, and that leads to the question on greenwashing. So you have a whole class called greenwashing here at the Slow Factory Open Education. So for those of you who are interested, I'll paste the link here for you to watch Aja's class on greenwashing. But very quickly,
I did use one slide from there. You might see a slide and be like, use that one. I did.
all good. It's all good. But just, let's close with greenwashing, because I think that's something that happens. We've called it out, we've identified it, but it still happens. And I think that we're running out of solutions to call it out, or to create a pressure on the organization or on the the brands to stop doing that. And again, from the Slow Factory perspective, we work behind the scenes. And the reason why there's greenwashing is because there is mismanagement of funds. We can perhaps sue companies for mismanaging funds, but they're not public organizations, so we won't go that far. But there is a mismanagement of funds where all the money is going into marketing. And I don't know if you've ever read the book from Naomi Klein, Logo.
No logo.
No Logo. Yeah, it's one of my favorite books. She talks a lot about these hollow companies. Like, she describes Nike as one of the first American hollow company, where it was all about the branding and very little about the manufacturing. In fact, there was no ties between the branding and the manufacturing. There were no relationships. That's when everything went offshore. And that's when greenwashing also started, not in the beginning because no one cared about sustainability, but as sustainability grew and grew in the public, as the demand, the first initiatives were taken on a marketing level. And also, and the funds are in marketing, in fact. So from the Slow Factory perspective, what we've been doing for the past 10 years is creating a way to divert money and divest money from marketing into impact. And what does that look like, and why would they do that, and to convince them to do that, and to promise them the same types of KPI. So in your own words, Aja, greenwashing, how do we solve it? How do we push brands to, from a public perspective, from a strategy perspective, from a design perspective? How do we get away from this? Because they're still going on with that. What do we do, Aja?
Think about how long it took our government to like regulate cigarettes. I gotta say, like, I don't have a ton of hope on this one. I like to be hopeful, but I think it's going to be more about informed citizens than asking for regulation, because until the people that greenwash lose the chokehold that they have on the government and stop being able to get into politicians' pockets so easily, I think that's going to be really hard to regulate. I'm really sorry. I want to be hopeful. Like, someone asked me a more hopeful question, because I don't have the answer to that one.
No, I know it's a difficult one. And again, just so you know, it takes a lot of, someone else asked, like, in the comments, because I'm trying to keep my eyes on everything, and someone was saying, I want to get out of the doom and gloom and feeling very pressured up, that there's no hope, to having hope and doing something. And I think hope is a verb, as Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson said at the study hall back in the day when we were able to meet in person. But hope is into the actions that we take. So again, just to go back to what Aja was saying, to changing the culture around how you interact with your friends, that is also bringing hope. For example, maybe creating a swap a clothing swap between you and your friends. I know that's something we like to do.
Communities in general. I mean, here in the UK, like, I think that there should be, you know, school uniform swaps like every so often because kids do grow, but like we don't need new uniforms, which most of those are made out of polyester as well, you know? So like I think we really have to really get into our communities and start to sort of spread this message and do it in like a fun way. You know what I mean? Like next time your organization is thinking about doing t-shirts for an event, why not ask if they could set up like a screen printing press where people can bring an old t-shirt and print on the t-shirt instead? There are so many creative ways that we can get people really thinking about planned obsolescence and clothing and whatnot, because one of the things that Liz is going to tell you is that free t-shirts are definitely an ecological crisis on its own, like t-shirts with every event, fundraisers, school things, yada, yada, yada. Half the time those end up in Cantamonto in like a month. So there are fun ways that we can get people thinking about these things.
Thank you, Aja, again. Thank you, Vestiaire Collective. And if we are done, let's hang up.
Thank you, everyone, for taking my class, and thank you all for your support. I have to say, like, I am so inspired by the people that become a part of the communities that we're in. And so thank you for being here. I'm really grateful.
I'm grateful as well. Thank you, Aja. Thank you, Slow Factory team. And thank you, Vestiaire, again. And most importantly, thank you to our American Sign Language interpreters, Jan and Stephanie. Thank you so much, Nick, who is handling and managing and leading our accessibility team at the Slow Factory. We are so grateful for you, Nick. And thank you, Stephanie and Jan. Thank you, everyone.
Goodbye.